it looks like getting rid of the two-child limit, that might reduce child poverty by about 500,000 kids or so. And to put that in perspective, child poverty rate at the moment is about 4.5 million kids are in child poverty. So it'd be fairly meaningful then on that number.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Before we start today's episode, a quick reminder that on the 4th of November, we will be recording the podcast in front of a live audience here in London. We will be talking about all things tax and budget. I'll be joined by our very own Stuart Adam and by Dan Needle, who is the founder of Tax Policy Associates. We'll look at all the various ways the Chancellor could raise revenues if she would like to, and we'll be taking your questions. This is part of the ESRC's Festival of Social Science. It is, of course, free to come along, but if you would like to come along, please do sign up quickly because places will go fast. For today, we are looking at the two-child limit. This is a policy that restricts support for children, which is given through universal credit and is worth around £3,500 per child per year to the first two children in a family. The two-child limit has had a cameo appearance in some of our recent podcasts, including our Are the Kids OK series over the summer. But given it's in the political spotlight, we've given it a podcast all of its own. It was a policy that was announced back in 2015 by then Chancellor George Osborne as part of a package of benefit cuts and motivated on the basis that, and I'm going to quote, the benefit system should not support lifestyles and rents that are not available to taxpayers who pay for that system. At the moment, there are loud calls from the Labour backbenchers to scrap the two-child limit in order to reduce child poverty. Many will be watching to see if Rachel Reeves finds the money in the budget to change the policy. So, as politicians grapple with what to do, we'll be looking at what the policy is, what effects it has, who it's affected, and what the options for changing the policy are. To do that, I'm joined by our very own Tom Waters and Christine Farquharson, who are colleagues here at the IFS. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
So look, let's start off, guys, with an overview of what this policy actually is. So Tom, what is the two-child limit?
Okay, so the two-child limit is a part of universal credit. So typically, if you're on universal credit, so you're on a low income, about the poorest quarter or so of the working age population, you get an extra £3,500 a year or so for each child. But if you have a third child or a subsequent child and they're born after April 2017, you don't get any extra UC in virtue of having them. So that's the two-child limit, and it means that for families that are affected by it, it reduces their income by something in the order of 10%.
And we should also say what it's not, because confusingly, lots of people have been starting to call it the two-child benefit limit. And I think confusing it with the benefit cap, or the two-child benefit cap, it's all getting confused with the name. So what is the benefit cap and why is it different to the two-child limit?
Exactly. So there's a completely separate policy which says that there's just a total cash amount that you can't go over, you can't get more than in benefits, which it varies a bit depending on where you are in the country, but for it's sort of in the low 20,000s per year. So that is just a separate policy. In order to be able to get £20,000 or £25,000 of benefits, you probably need to have quite a few kids, and so often if you're affected by one of these policies, you'd also be affected by the other one, but they are separate. Great.
So I think to help people understand what's kind of going on here and the choice the governments make, it's worth looking at some example families or some examples of what people are getting, because as well as the money within universal credit for families with low incomes, there's also child benefit. Let's look at some example families of how much support people are getting depending on how many children they have.
Okay, so suppose that you have 3 children and the two-child limit wasn't in place and you're on universal credit, then you'd be getting about £10,500 in universal credit for the kids. You'd also get child benefit worth about £3,000. So £13,500 kind of that's labelled, if you like, as for the kids. You might also be getting other elements in a universal credit. You might be getting support for your rent, for example, and you also just get support for the adults in the family. If you take a kind of a typical lone parent who's got 3 kids, who's out of work, they in total might be getting something in the neighbourhood of £25,000, depending on their exact circumstances.
Something like £25,000 total for a family, a single parent family with 3 kids, something like £13,500 of which is going to the children. If there was no two-child limit in place. If there is a two-child limit in place, so actually they're not getting that £13,500, they're getting something more like £10,000.
£10,000, exactly.
So they're losing that £3,500. Shall we look at why it was introduced and what the arguments for it are? I mentioned at the top the quote from George Osborne's speech, which really, it was part of this package of measures, which was cutting benefits overall. But you look back at what they were saying, at least, and it was really all talking about fairness between families that do and don't get benefits, and trying to have the financial incentives for families with children on benefits and those with children without benefits to more closely align.
You've got to keep in mind the context of the time. So we had 2015 general election, and the Conservative manifesto included a commitment to shave £12 billion off welfare. So it came in, and then, emergency summer budget straight after that. And the two-child limit was one of the measures that was going to get them on the road towards a £12 billion savings. That was also the time, they froze all working age benefits, actually a bigger benefit cut. They made some cuts to disability benefits, things like that. But the two-child limit was, a decent chunk of that £12 billion. I think you've got to see it in the context of a desire to reduce the working age benefit bill. As you say, kind of some of the arguments given were around, we want to make it the case that families who have larger numbers of kids face the same kind of financial incentives as those that aren't on benefits, something like that.
Tom, how much do we know about whether these families are kind of persistently on benefits and they're facing that trade-off, deciding whether to have that third kid in the full knowledge that this is the benefit system they're facing and that that's going to be important to them, versus maybe having that third kid and then something happens down the line and they fall into benefits, but maybe hadn't considered that or hadn't factored the two-child limit in when they were making those decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, one thing we do know is that seen over longer periods of time, the number of people that are at some point interact with the means tested benefit system is quite a lot more than the number affected by the number get on any given day. So over some research shows, like over an 18-year period, a majority of people will get working age benefits. Over a lifetime, it's going to be even more than that. If you've got quite a large number of kids, I think there is a higher chance that you're just persistently on benefits, because the benefit system does distribute more cash towards those with more children. But certainly there'll be plenty of people in the case you described where they have the third kid not on benefits, then they lose their job or something like that.
So clearly it's in the news right now because I mentioned at the top, Labour MPs, backbenchers, many of them are very unhappy with the policy and want it to be removed or at least modified. Let's walk through some of the impacts the policy has had. And I think we have to start with the poverty, because that's the one that's clearly very salient and that's captured imagination. So Tom, give us some of the numbers about that.
It looks like getting rid of the two-child limit, that might reduce child poverty by about 500,000 kids or so. And to put that in perspective, child poverty rate at the moment is about 4.5 million kids are in child poverty. So it'd be a fairly meaningful dent on that number. And the kind of wider context here is actually, if you look at trends in child poverty and I'm talking about relative child poverty, if you look at trends in child poverty over the last 10 or 15 years, all of the growth is in families with at least 3 kids. And actually families with 1 or 2 kids, poverty rates have actually fallen. So that's not only about the two-child limit. There's other important policies as well, but the two-child limit is going to be playing an important role there.
And we're expecting the government to have a child poverty strategy, is that what it's called, to try to reduce poverty, and this will be one of the main things they might levers they might pull to get that down quickly.
Yeah, and it's certainly the most targeted lever they can pull, in the sense of how many kids do you get out of poverty per pound spent. It's targeted towards low-income families and, by definition, larger families. So if you pull one family over the poverty line through the two-child limit, you're pulling at least 3 kids over the poverty line. And so it's a well-targeted measure if the goal is to get poverty rates down.
How much does that interact with something like the benefit cap that you mentioned at the top? So if you do the two-child limit just on its own and you leave the benefit cap where it is, given that a lot of these families are being subject to this overall limit on the amount of benefits they can receive, how does that change the picture?
Say you have 3 children and you're affected by the benefit cap. You get rid of the two-child limit, it doesn't actually help you, because you're still hitting that overall cash cap. And so if you got rid of both policies at once, that would actually make a meaningfully larger impact on poverty. I think perhaps an important twist on that is that it would make a bigger impact still on what you might describe as deep poverty. So people that are quite a way below the poverty line. If you're hit by the benefit cap, you're more likely to be quite some distance below the poverty line. I mean, it's worth saying that, this is like a limitation of child poverty measures, which just count people. Are you above or below a line? If you're, way below the line and then you go up to somewhat less far below the line, that does nothing to child poverty, but obviously it matters a lot for the families involved.
And I mean, it reminds me of some of the debates we've had in the kitchen over a cup of tea about, like, actually where you draw that line is fundamentally quite an arbitrary choice. And we're drawing these lines to try and measure things that we think are important and measure them in persistent ways over time. But that's like quite a different question from saying there's some sort of fundamental scientific inviolable principle that this is where the line must be.
Exactly. And so I tend to think we should be thinking about what's happening to child poverty over time, or poverty rates in general over time. How does poverty vary between different groups? And that's probably more informative than the overall number, which, as you say, it's based on an arbitrary line. It's not that someone's gone around with a clipboard and decided that this is the amount of cash that you need to not be in poverty.
But given all of that, am I right in saying that there are about 4.5 million children who are in relative poverty? The 2-child limit, removing that would get about 500,000 out of poverty, but they're the ones, I assume, who are closest to the poverty line. So they're the ones you'd just tip over. You would be doing a lot less for the children who are in kind of this deeper poverty to get them closer to being less poor.
Yeah, I mean, some would be just getting closer to it, but you're right that, you'd have to be within £3,500 of the poverty line to get tipped over. Yeah.
So, Christine, this came up in our series in the summer exactly because this linked to poverty. So the concern, we had a discussion with Sam Friedman, I think, and the concern was that you have this policy in place, it puts more children into poverty. Won't that have effects on other things for those children? The one that we discussed a lot was this kind of school readiness. Maybe remind us what school readiness is, and let's talk about that.
Yeah, so the school readiness measure that people are kind of bandying around right now is something that's actually measured at the end of your first year in school, kind of slightly counterintuitively. And it's your teacher goes and assesses, can you do all of these different things? And you kind of tot that all up. And if you can do most of the things to an adequate standard, then you're counted as having a good level of development. And that's all kind of has been quite arcane and in the background. And then people like me are really excited right now because everybody knows about the good level of development measure, because that's at the cornerstone of the government's opportunity mission target. We want to move from about 2/3 of kids meeting that good level of development by the end of their reception years, by age 5, to about 75% of them doing it in just a few years' time, which is really quite close.
Can I just flag again for those who didn't hear our series? I'm still shocked that 1/3 of children aren't meeting this. I mean, that still seems like a lot of children who aren't meeting what is deemed to be a good level of development.
I'm still surprised, even after 4 hours of brilliant podcast episodes, which people can go back and listen to at their own in their own way. Fundamentally, I think in those podcasts, when we had those discussions around this good level of development measure, a lot of people who we spoke to, and myself included, said, well, this isn't really just about the school system. This isn't something where all of the tools that solve this problem are going to be things that reception teachers are doing. In some sense, we need to know a lot more about the wider context that child is growing up in, because that's going to inform how they develop at home, as well as the opportunities that they have and how they take advantage of those at school. And so it's, in some sense, like a really logical next step to look at that and say, well, we know that income or family resources are one of the biggest correlates of these inequalities in how children develop. We know that, for every step you take up the income distribution, your chances of doing well in school increase proportionally. And so in some sense, wouldn't it be great if we could just take some of those kids from the bottom of the income distribution and move them up a little bit? And isn't that something that would really help us to meet some of these goals around school readiness? And that's a very logical, sensible starting point, right? And we do have evidence from around the world that suggests that, at least in some contexts, at least in some ways, that's a tool that can work to some extent. But we also know that those effects are smaller than I think we often expect that they would be. If you're used to just looking at those raw gaps, those raw inequalities, you expect in some sense that giving families money will have a much bigger impact than it actually does. And in work that Tom and some of our other colleagues have recently released, they looked specifically at the 2-child limit and impacts on school readiness. And they did that by comparing children, third and subsequent children who were born sort of just before that April 2017 point where the 2-child limit was introduced, versus those who were born just after. And they found, really quite small effects on this headline school readiness measure. Now, this is one measure out of many. And it, again, kind of like the poverty line, has this property that we're looking at up or down, above or below. It's a binary thing. So if a lot of children who are quite far off that target are being impacted by the 2-child limit, but in ways that don't push them above that threshold, we wouldn't see that. But what Tom and our colleagues have done is they've looked at, well, how big of an effect might we be able to detect given the data that we have and given the setup that we have? And really, they're able to rule out even pretty small effects on the proportion of children meeting this good level of development. Now, that's one argument, that's one outcome of many. But I think what it speaks to, and Tom put this really well in the report, is actually it's not a kind of kill two birds with one stone. You can make a case around the 2-child limit, specifically around child poverty. And like Tom says, this is one of the best targeted policies to do that. But that's not the same as making a case that this is going to be something that's really going to make a material difference on this other target that the government has set itself.
It's worth highlighting that the research that Christine's just pointed out has surprised lots of people. Lots of people thought that the 2-child limit would be affecting school readiness, and it hasn't. And that's a very robust result. But it's also true to say, Tom, there are other things that it could be affecting.
Yeah, so you might think perhaps it affects the children's health, for example, could affect the parents' health, could affect the relationships between parents and children, the household, things like that. And we do have a broader set of evidence, internationally, not really in the UK very much, which looks at how income affects children's outcomes. And there certainly is some evidence that suggests that these sorts of things can be affected by income. At the same time, there's also, especially in the States, there's increasing amount of research which is actually using randomized controlled trials to give cash to families, which is actually showing relatively little effect, which Christine and I were talking about the other day.
Yeah, so these trials are really interesting because in some sense, this is kind of the gold standard for how you would evaluate a policy tool called Give Families Extra Cash. And they give families like pretty meaningful amounts of extra cash. Some of them are more targeted at more vulnerable or low-income families. Some of them have a bit of a wider population of interest. There's a few of these trials running in a few different places, and they've really invested in their data collection. So they're measuring all kinds of outcomes from sort of parental stress to parental employment to household income to like literally doing brain scans of people in the households in some cases. And when you're measuring across that many outcomes, you're always going to find some effects in some places. But I think the consistent lesson that's coming out of those randomized trials is actually the effects are much smaller. And in most of those outcomes, they're not really picking up anything at all. So that's kind of puzzling in some sense because we think that income is important and we think that something like the 2-child limit would be incident on something, right? In some way, that policy is making families' incomes lower. And so you would imagine that that's going to have some real effects. Tom's work rules out that real effect is on school readiness. There may well be other real effects. We know in some literatures, for example, that mothers in particular cut back on what they eat or what they consume in order to protect the amount that's going to their children and make sure that their children aren't going hungry. So it's completely plausible that there would be all kinds of impacts like that in this context, in this policy. But it's also worth saying that this wider evidence we have from the US is looking in lots of different places and so far not finding tremendous benefits from topping up families' incomes.
Okay, but the 2-child limit does increase poverty. It doesn't reduce school readiness. And there are obviously two things that matter a lot for thinking about those kind of children who are affected by this. Tom, it also affects work incentives of the parents.
Yeah, it does affect work incentives in a couple of ways. So one way you might think of it is, well, if I get into work now and I wouldn't be entitled to universal credit if I'm in work, well, I've got kind of less universal credit when I'm out of work. I get into work, I don't get any universal credit. That means that my incentive to get into work has been strengthened. Another way of thinking about it is, well, the policy, the implementation of the 2-child limit, it just reduced the amount of income I have. And so one way I might be looking around and thinking, what am I going to do about that? One way I might respond is by increasing the amount that I work. There is some research on this which suggests that amongst mothers, it's perhaps increased employment by about 1.5%, which is not an enormous number, but not totally insignificant either. I think part of the reason why we don't perhaps get a bigger effect. It actually comes back to this point about the benefit cap that we were talking about before, is if you're out of work and you're benefit capped, then the 2-child limit doesn't hit you when you're out of work. It only kind of affects you when you're in work. So that kind of slightly complicates the story. But overall, we should be thinking, this is going to have a modest effect on labour supply.
Okay, so modest effect on labour supply, no effect on school readiness, as measured when children are 5, but an effect on poverty. People take different views on whether the policy is right or wrong, whether they want to get rid of it or not. But there are definitely some big parts of the Labour Party who do want to get rid of it. So let's think about options for removing it. I mean, obviously the one that's banded around is just scrap it altogether, so that all children would be eligible for this £3,500 if they're in a family that's getting universal credit. That will cost about £3 billion, I think I'm right in saying, Tom. But it's not the only option, right? There are lots of other ways you could modify this policy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe the next most obvious one would be go from a 2-child limit to a 3-child limit. And so you just sort of, you go one rung up the ladder. That would, I think we're going to have some work coming out on this. That would do something like, it would cost something like 2/3 of the cost of the 2-child limit. Basically, part of the reason for that is there aren't actually a tremendous number of families that have got at least 4 kids that are on UC. And again, coming back to the overall benefit cap, it interacts with the benefit cap as well. Again, that those larger families are especially likely to be hit by the benefit cap. So that would be one way of doing it. You'd incur most of the cost, presumably have most of the effect on poverty, but without going the whole way.
They could also change how much you get per child. So at the moment, we're talking about a benefit for every child you get around £3,500. And if you removed it completely, you'd get £3,500 per child. It could be that actually you get more for the first child and then less for subsequent children.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of a coherence to that. You might think that there are economies of scale in having children. Perhaps each child kind of costs you a bit less than the previous one. And there was a way in which the benefit system historically used to reflect this, that in universal credit or in tax credits which preceded it, you would get more for the first child than you would for the second. And you could imagine kind of pushing that principle further and say, well, you get more for the first and less for the second and less for the third and less for the fourth, or something like that. That would be one way of going about it. So you're kind of tapering down the amount of cash that you get for each child. And in some sense, yeah, but maybe that's if you're designing this policy from scratch, maybe that's a more natural way of thinking about it, rather than saying you get £3,500 for the first kid, £3,500 for the second kid, 0 for the third. That's kind of quite, in one sense, kind of a slightly strange profile.
Yeah, it ties in again with something that you and I have talked about before, which is around what are you actually trying to achieve here? Are you trying to subsidize or support families for the actual costs that they're incurring? In which case you might think that there are these economies of scale, or that there is a sort of profile, both in terms of the number of children, but actually also in terms of the ages of those children and what stages of life are most expensive. Or are you trying to take more of a almost needs blind kind of viewpoint, where you're saying, well, what do we think is reasonable for somebody in your situation to spend? What do we think is reasonable for you to have? And government's going to pay for that. But anything that you're incurring, any costs you have above that level, like, you're on your own, that's your own decision.
Yeah, and the government over the 2010s seemed to be moving more towards this reasonable standard. So another example would be, it used to be that the amount of support you could get for your rent was more generous. You could get kind of up to the amount of rent that you paid. That's kind of the amount that you could get with some cap, but a fairly high cap. With some cap, you could get up to the amount of rent you paid in housing benefit. And that was being restricted in various ways. And one way of thinking about that is the government is kind of saying, we're going to give you what we think is reasonable for someone to have, even if your true costs are higher. And coming back to the 2-child limit, exactly as you say, perhaps the government kind of takes the view, well, yeah, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 kids, but we're only going to think it's reasonable for us to support the first 2. And it does seem like a different philosophy, a different kind of approach to what the benefit system is trying to do.
And it's different as well to some of what we might think of as the wider landscape of support for children. So this reasonable standard really seems to come in when it's about households and like how much income should households have. When we see programs like free school meals or childcare support or Healthy Start vouchers, where it's much more, we want to provide this to the child, that becomes much more of a sort of actual. You don't get kicked out of the family hub if you've got 3 kids. Like, all of them are welcome. If you've got 7 kids, they all get free school meals if you're entitled. But it's what I guess is sort of labeled at and specifically targeted to the child themselves versus what's supporting the household and that wider context that they grow up in.
Yeah, and I suppose public services as well. Like, it's not like, oh, only your first two kids can go to school, or only your first two kids can go to a hospital. Exactly. So in one sense, it's quite different to the way that we treat kids elsewhere in the broader system.
So if the government did want to move to a system more of kind of a tapering of the benefit, which I think is we have a child benefit too. So the child benefit, you get different amounts per child. I mean, obviously Rachel Reeves is looking very closely at the kind of overall cost of everything, because it's going to be a tight budget, a budget in which you'll almost certainly have to raise taxes for other reasons. The cost will matter here. I mean, rough ballpark, how much would she save if you did something that was like, you'll give some benefit for the third child, but we'll give less? I mean, is there a way to basically do something that's cheaper?
Yeah, we obviously, yeah. I guess
Enough
it depends.
cheaper.
Yeah. I think here you're inevitably you're faced with you're just faced with a straight trade-off that you could do a taper, but very aggressively, so you get almost nothing for the third kid, and it'd be pretty much the same as still having the 2-child limit. As I said, getting rid of going to a 3-child limit would cost about the 2/3 of getting rid of the policy completely, and so a taper would be, I guess, somewhere in between that. So if you want to really not spend very much cash at all, you'd have to taper like quite aggressively, which might look a little bit funny. Say, we're getting rid of the 2-child limit, but the third kid, only generates you an extra
£50 or something.
50 quid. Exactly. 2-child limit's gone.
Okay. But when cash is strapped, I mean, looking at exactly how much, there's a middle ground there between giving a full £3,500 per child and giving something else that was meaningful but not quite as expensive. So that brings us to an end of our episode on the 2-child limit. We've talked about its various effects. It's a policy that does increase child poverty to the tune of about 500,000 children. It doesn't decrease school readiness, so it's not affecting the number of children who are reaching a good level of development at 5. It also increases work incentives for parents. People clearly differ to a large degree on whether they love or hate the policy. People who like it tend to think about fairness between families with and without children and who should be getting support. Those who hate it often point to that effect on child poverty. If the government does want to get rid of it, it would cost around £3 billion to get rid of it completely. They could instead take an approach of giving some benefits to families with more than 2 children, but not at the full amount. They could taper the benefit away. So lots of choices for the government as they enter the budget period. But for now, let me thank Tom and Christine, and thank all of you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe to the IFS Zooms In your podcast app and share it with anyone you think might be interested. And if you'd like to support our work further, you can do so for as little as £10 a month. You can just check the link in the episode description. And we'll see you next time.